Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today we are going to make a small crossbody bag with no hardware. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today we're going to make a crossbody bag for a quilter who isn't sure they want to get into bag making. I can appreciate that it's a bit of a commitment to go out and find interfacing and to buy zippers and to buy bag hardware, and maybe you're not sure that that's what you're interested in. So I have taken the Koda Cross Body Bag pattern, which you can get for free at the link below in the description box, and I've adjusted it to make it without hardware. And that's why the video is called No Hardware, No Problem. So there's a few sacrifices. There's no zippers, which means the bag doesn't have a closure on it. You could do a few things with fabric and buttons and things if you'd like, but this is no hardware, no problem. So let's dive in to making this bag. I've cut all of my materials for the crossbody bag with no hardware. And these are generally materials that quilters should have. So I have cotton for the front. Sorry, this is the back of the bag. So I have a piece of cotton. I have a piece of batting that I'm going to use to thicken it up a little bit. And then I have a piece of fabric that I don't particularly like. Because I'm going to quilt this, I want a little piece of fabric in the back to add a little bit of stability, but also because I don't like to run just the batting under my machine. I like to have a piece of fabric in between. So in fact, I'm not sure if you can see on camera, it's actually a tiny bit short, but I'm not worried about that. So that's going to be the back of the bag. And these are the dimensions that are in the Koda crossbody bag pattern. So this is, I think, 10 by 10 and a half inches. Then I have a piece for the front, 10 and a half by 7 inches. Same thing with a piece of batting and a piece of just fabric that I don't like very much. That's just going to be in the back there for when I quilt it. I have an accent fabric that's going to go on the top of my bag, and this is 3 by 10 and a half inches. Same thing, the fabric, the batting, and the back. Then I have the lining for my bag, and that's just 2 pieces of cotton. And I have 2 more pieces here. These are, I believe these are cut the same size as the back, as the lining. Yes, they are. Oh, no, they're a tiny bit shorter. I'll put the dimensions on the screen here. These are going to be the pockets that I'm going to add inside. Because we're not doing a front zippered pocket like the pattern has, I'd like pockets for the inside of my bag. So that's what these pieces are going to be. And then for the strap, this is going to be an experiment, and I'm pretty confident it's going to turn out, but we'll see how this goes. I have a piece of batting. This is 1.5 inches wide, and I have these 2 pieces of fabric for an idea to make the strap. 1.5 inches for these pieces and 2.5 for these pieces. So the first step is to prepare all of our pieces. So I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and put some quilting into the 3 pieces, the 2 pieces for the front plus the back. I might just do some straight line stitching on this piece for some interest, and maybe just an all over free motion on the other 2 pieces. But you could quilt these any way you like. You can quilt them in a grid pattern, you can free motion quilt them, you could do some fancy schmancy design if you're able to do that. This can be as simple or as complex as you'd like it to be. I think the more thread you put into it, however, the more structure you're going to be able to give to your final bag. But if you want something that's really slouchy and casual, that's going to work out really well too. I'll take these over to the machine and then come back and talk about next steps to start to construct this. I've put some quilting into my pieces, into this piece for the front panel, just a little bit of free motion all over the place, but I did take a minute and just sort of trace around this front flower just to make it pop out a little bit. But that needs to be squared up now, or cut down to the proper size, which is 7 by 10 and a half. So I'm just going to bring my big ruler and just trim off this extra. I did something very similar, 7, didn't I say? 7 by 10 and a half. These are all the measurements in the Koda Cross Body Bag, so you'll be able to get those from the pattern. 10.5. I did some free motion on the back as well. And then for the front panel, for the sort of the decorative panel across the front of this, I just did some straight line stitching here to make a little bit of a quilted look for the top part. I'm not going to trim that up. There's enough here that that'll all get caught in the seam allowances. To do this, I actually used one of my favorite tools. It's my bone folder. And I just used my ruler and I just used this to create little dents. See if I put another one in here. You might be able to see that on camera if I hit the light the right way. And then that just rubs out very easily. With my bone folder and my ruler, I just spaced the lines 3/4 of an inch apart, drew them with the bone folder, sewed them, flipped it all over, did exactly the same thing on the other side, and now have this really cute little quilted top piece. And then the back is here as well, and that's quilted. So to construct the front panel, I'm going to sew the shorter piece to the other piece, flip that back over, and then give this a top stitch. And then our front panel is going to be ready. The next thing to prepare is the strap. And because we're doing no hardware, you want to make sure that you get the strap the right length. So you have a couple of options for that. If you have a crossbody bag already that you like the way it sits and fits on you, measure that strap so you have an idea of how long works for you. If not, take a tape measure, drape it up and over your body, and get a sense of how long you want your strap to be. I have another Koda Cross Body Bag here that I made, and I'm really happy with the length of this strap. So I'm going to give this a measure, and that'll tell me how long works for me. And then I'm going to add an inch for either side. So I'm going to add 2 inches total, and that is going to be the strap length that I'm going to make with the fabric that I have here. So let me just quickly drag my tape measure across this strap and see what I've got. Because we're not using any hardware, there's no opportunity to adjust this. So you want to make sure you're happy with the length, because if it's too long or too short, you're not going to use it. So this is 49 inches, and I'm just going to double check that across my body by stringing the tape measure around, and that feels about right. So for me, I'm going to work on getting a 51-inch strap. These extra 2 inches are to stick the ends of the strap into the bag to be able to use it to attach. So 51 inches is what I'm aiming for. So I'm going to go over to the machine and sew these pieces together like we talked about. And then I'm going to sew these and these strap pieces together so I have pieces that are at least 51 inches long. And then we'll come back and talk about next steps. So my front panel is sewn together. I have just sewn with a 1/4 inch seam, gave that a really good press, and then put a little layer, a line of black top stitching just across the top there, just to give it a nice finished edge. So the front panel is ready, the back panel is ready, and I'm going to have to revisit the measurements because these are supposed to be the same size. So let me double check what went wrong. But while I'm double checking what went wrong, we can continue on. I have also made my strap pieces. This is the 1.5 inch piece, and it's about 55 inches. I need about 51 inches, but I'm okay to work with just a tiny bit extra in this case. Same thing here with the back piece. So those are long enough. I also have my piece of batting, which is more than long enough. So we're going to come back to the strap in a second. First, let's talk about the pockets. So these pieces, I've actually trimmed them down. They are now 10 inches long by 9.5 inches wide. So the 9.5 inches is going to be the final width of your pocket. So what I'm going to do is fold these in half, right sides together, fold one in half, fold the other one in half, I'm going to take them over to the machine and run a 1/4 inch seam allowance down both of these sides. And then I'm going to turn them right side out. That is going to create the pocket. I'm going to go do that now. I'm going to double check what's going on here and then talk about the next steps. So I have figured out what is going on with my back panel. My first problem was that I had cut it a little bit large in order to allow for a little shifting as I quilted it. So I squared it up to the initial size in the Koda Cross Body Bag pattern, which is 10.5 by 10.25. But that's still a little bit too big because we've made an adjustment here. On the original pattern, you insert a zipper piece in here in order to have a front pocket. But because we're not dealing with any hardware, you lose out on having that 1-inch zipper in there to take up a little bit of space. So that's why I have a little extra here. So now I am going to just trim these so that they are even. This is one of the sacrifices that we're going to make without using any hardware on this project. I think it's still going to come out really well, but that explains why my backing is just a tiny bit bigger than it's supposed to be. So now we have the front and back completely prepped and looking good. I've also taken a moment to sew down the two sides of the pockets. So this is the 9.5-inch dimension by 10.5. So now fold it in half. I'm just going to trim these little corners just so that I can turn this right side out and get a nice sharp corner. I'm going to do that on both of them. And then I'm going to turn the pocket right side out like this. I'll take this over to the iron and give it a nice press. And then I'll take it back over to the machine and just put 1 or 2 layers of really tight top stitching here just to give the top of this pocket a little bit of structure, just with some thread. So I'm going to do that with both of them, and then we'll talk about attaching the pocket to the lining pieces, and then onto the strap and finishing. I'm going to trim up my lining pieces because I didn't think far enough forward in altering this pattern to realize that all of these pieces need to be a little bit smaller to account for the lack of zipper on the front of the project. So now that the lining pieces are exactly the size they need to be and my pockets are finished, I just put a little bit of stitching across the top, really just for decorative purposes. The next step is to orient the pockets on the lining. And I want to put these raw edges inside. So what I'm going to do is line up my pocket so that it's well centered, and I'm going to line it up in such a way that once I make this seam, once I sew that seam, when I flip these up, the raw edges are on the inside of the pocket, and the pocket lands about where I want it to inside the lining. I don't want it too close to the bottom because we are going to box the corners and we don't want the pockets to get caught up in that. And I don't want it so close to the top that things that stick out of the pocket are going to be too close to the top. So I think that's probably about perfect. I will line up the other pocket the exact same way, flip these over, and then take them over to the sewing machine and just sew along this raw edge so that it's attached to the lining. I'll also then, either with a pencil or I might even just eyeball it, and draw and sew a seam up and down this center part of the pocket. So I actually end up with two separate compartments in my pocket. You can make these as wide or as narrow as you want. If you've got a really big phone, you might want one that's extra wide. If you've got a little change purse or a business card holder or something, you might want one that's customized for that size. You might want one that's perfectly sized for your lipstick. You might want one that's long and skinny and just leave it like this so you can lay pens down. However you want to shape and size your pockets, totally up to you. So I'm going to go do that for both, and then we will talk about getting the strap constructed. I have the pockets sewn on here. You can see I've got the raw edge sewn, and then I flipped this back up and gave it a nice press on both of them. And I think I forgot to mention in the last little segment that you need to top stitch up the sides to secure your pocket in place. And then if you're going to divide your pocket, put that seam anywhere across the pocket that you want in order to divide it. I'm going to go do that now and then back to the straps. With the pockets finished, let's now move on to the strap. So I want to make the strap a little bit thicker, which is why I have the piece of batting. So what I want to do is, and trust me, this is going to turn out really, really interesting, but it's going to look a little weird for the beginning. So I want you to lay the 2.5-inch piece of strap fabric. Then I want you to put down your 1.5-inch, and you want to line these edges up all the way along, and then put your batting like this. And then sew a 1/4-inch seam all the way down the side. All right, once we're done that, we'll come back and I'll talk about the next step. So I have sewn my 2.5-inch strap piece with my 1.5-inch strap piece right sides together and the batting on top. And I've sewn that all the way down the line. Then I took it over to the iron and I gave it a little press. And I am also going to just cut this end off. I'm just going to zip it across like that. So now my pieces are even. I have also now, this is a little weird, but trust me on this. I have found this piece of almost like a shoelace. Had tied up a fat quarter bundle. And I'm going to use this. You can find a 1-inch piece of fabric. You can find, well, a 1-inch piece of fabric would probably work best. If you have one of these from a fat quarter bundle, see if you can find one. And then what I've done is I've actually sewn on the piece I cut off from my backing piece that we quilted. And this piece is now the same length or a little bit longer than my strap all along here. And this is going to be my turning tool. So if I lay it out, it's a little bit longer. This, once we're finished, is what I'm going to pull on, hopefully, to turn my strap right side out. So I really hope this works. But what I want you to do is find something like this, a 1-inch piece of fabric, a lace, a shoelace would work beautifully, something that's not going to tear really easily. So I wouldn't use a piece of batting, but a piece of fabric would absolutely work. Even just a nice piece of kitchen twine that's strong enough. I'm going to sew this into place here. And then I'm going to take my entire thing and fold it over and then sew down with a 1/4-inch seam all along this other side. I will probably put this under my machine like this, line up this edge of the 2.5-inch piece of fabric all the way along the bottom, making sure my turning string is tucked nice and deep inside there so it's not getting caught in the seam allowance. So go give that a shot, and then we'll come back and see if this brilliant plan to turn the strap is going to work. So this is my strap all sewn together. I have this little bit of poof here because you'll see when we turn it inside out, I want this 2.5-inch fabric to wrap around the 1.5-inch fabric to give me a nice border on my strap. But that's sewn all the way down, and I have my little tug piece sticking out the bottom. So now is kind of the moment of truth to see if by pulling on this, and by pulling I mean very gently encouraging my strap to turn itself right side out. We'll see if this is going to work. I think I'm going to have to encourage this at the start. So I'm just going to turn it with my fingers. I've left the top end open, even though I've sewn that lace piece to the top of my strip. The top is otherwise open. So I'm just going to try and encourage that to get started with my thumb. And now I'm hoping that by pulling this along, it starts to turn it inside out. I hope. I'm not sure which direction to pull on it to encourage it to do this, but in principle, this should work. I think it's just a matter of getting it going. I couldn't think of any other way to easily turn a 51-inch piece right side out that was this skinny. So by having a little pull strap, I'm hoping that this will work. This is taking a little more encouragement than I was hoping. I don't want to yank on it too hard because I don't want to stretch things out of shape. It was already challenging enough to sew these long skinny pieces together. Oh, there we go. There we go. Ah, yay! A little bit of patience to get it going at the front end, and it's working. Oh, that's cool. So I'm just pulling on my pull string here, and coming back up to the top end, pulling a little bit more and encouraging it to pull itself right side out. Pausing to pull it through a little, encourage it, continuing to pull, whoops, continuing to pull on my little pull string here. And yeah, well, that's exciting. Sometimes I have these brilliant ideas and I'm never quite sure if they're going to work. And so you can see down here at this end, the finished product is starting to emerge like a snake shedding its skin on the other side. Look at that. And now that this is all the way through, I can just grab onto this good piece itself and continue to pull that end off. Look at that. Look at that. That's exciting. And so now I will just trim that off because it has served its purpose. And then take this over to the ironing board and very carefully give this a press. I'm looking to have about a 1/4 inch of the wider fabric across the back of my strap roll around onto the front. So I'm just going to manipulate that with my hands and give that a good press. And then I'm going to run a stitch in the ditch down here, just again to give my strap a little bit of substance and to hold it all together. I'm really pleased with that. I'm really thrilled that that turning method worked. I'll definitely use that again. I have finished making the strap. After turning it right side out, I took it over to the iron and pressed it nice and flat. And then I took it back over to the sewing machine, and with my walking foot, I just put a seam along this seam on the front, just to give it a little bit more texture and just to hold everything together. I put my walking foot on for that step and it worked really well. And I think if you haven't sewn your strap yet already, I'd recommend putting a walking foot on if you have one. So now I am just going to take my ruler and my cutter and cut off this edge nice and straight and take away my little turner, which I'm thrilled at how well that worked out. I'm just going to cut it off for now. I will grab the seam ripper in a minute and just pull this off and use it for something else, or hopefully use it again as a turning tool, but glad that worked out as well as it did. I'm also just going to double check the measurement of my strap. So I know my board is 24 inches, so that's 24, 48, 49, 50, 51. So that's what I had said, because I wanted a 49-inch strap plus an extra inch on each side. So I'm just going to trim that off right there. So some leftovers. But now I've got two nice clean ends on my strap, and it's all ready to put the layers together. So this is a tiny bit brain bending, but bear with me. In the end, I want the strap to come off the front piece here, obviously with this tucked in, but bear with me. And then I want it to come up and around my body and connect to the back side of the bag here. I sometimes find that this visualization is just really, really useful. So imagine the bag is finished and the strap comes off the front and ends on the back. So we know that that's right. So to get the strap lined up properly in front, I am going to turn this over. I'm going to move it in about about an inch, I think. That'll give me a nice amount for a seam allowance to sew the sides together. And I'm also going to extend this out probably about 3/4 of an inch. That accounts for the extra inch we added to both sides plus a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to take one of my lining pieces, and this is with the pockets open towards the top, and I'm just going to clip all this in place. And this is where my microphone ran out of battery. So unfortunately, we're going to have to finish the video with a little bit of a voiceover. So I'm going to try to recreate whatever I was saying as I was finishing this bag. So let's go. As I was saying, I've positioned the handle, the strap, and now the lining so that I can take it over to the sewing machine. I'm going to make sure that I backstitch a couple of times back and forth over that strap to give it some really good strength. And then I'll sew across the top to attach the lining to the front of the bag. And then I want to do the same thing for the back in terms of lining everything up properly. So similarly to the front, making sure the strap is set about 1 inch in from the edge of the bag and then about 3/4 of an inch up extra hanging over. That was that extra that we allowed for in the final length, if you remember. And then making sure the lining piece goes on properly with the opening for the pockets up, everything lined up properly. I'll sew across there as well, and then also make sure to go back and forth across that area where the strap is just to reinforce it a little bit. So I've done that here on the back, and you can see that extra from the strap is sticking out. It's been reinforced, and I think that looks really good. And then I've put the top stitching just across the edge there, just to finish that edge of the back side of the bag, and I think that's looking really good. Double checking yet again just to make sure there's no twist in the strap. I haven't put the top stitching into the top yet. I think I just wanted to double check that everything was right. It would be easier to fix it if that top stitching wasn't in there. And I wanted to change the color of my thread because I've got black thread for the back side and I want to use the white or cream thread for the front side here. So all sewn in properly but still lacking that top stitching. So I'll give it a good press and then take it back to the machine to get that top stitching put in. And then just another double check just to make sure everything's lined up properly and it's looking really good. So very confident this is all the way that it should be in order to get the bag to turn out properly. So that stitching has now been done across the top stitching across the front. Everything looks really good. And so now the next step is to open everything up so that the lining pieces are together, right sides together, and the front and back of the bag are also right sides together, laid out with the strap tucked inside. And that's how we're going to sew the whole thing together. So tuck that strap inside the bag. You may have seen in the other Koda Cross Body Bag video where I had forgotten to leave the zipper open. That's not a worry in this case. We want to make sure that we line up these seams and edges really, really well. I'll use clips and I'll clip it all the way around to make sure everything is lined up nice and even. And then in order to sew the bag all the way around, start with the lining piece and make sure to leave a good opening. I always leave the opening way too small, so I'm consciously trying to leave a nice large opening, maybe 4 or 5 inches. You want to make sure you start and stop at both sides of that opening and then sew all the way around, back stitching when you end. Once you've sewn that around, the next step is to box the corners. So I've just reached inside the lining and I've just laid out those lining pieces on that diagonal so that the seams nest together. And then I'm going to take my ruler and a pencil, and from the seam line, from where my seam is, not from where the seam allowance is, but from where the end of the seam is, I'm going to measure back 1 inch and draw a line. And that's the line that seam line is how I'm going to box the corners. I'm going to reinforce that as I sew it, so I'll go back and forth over it a couple of times. It's much less important in the lining because this is going to be in the very bottom inside of your bag, but you want to make sure you take your time to line up those seams really well for the outside of the bag, because this is the part that's going to show. So make sure that those seams are nested. You'll be able to feel that they're locked in nice and tight with the seams going in opposite direction to lock them into place. Measure in the same way that you did for the lining, so an inch from the seam line, not the seam allowance, the seam line, and then draw that line in order to stitch it. Once you've stitched all four corners, I just use my scissors and cut those corners off. Simple as that. You could use a rotary cutter if you want, but I find my scissors work really well. Just cut those off, and then generally ready now to turn the bag. I find instead of trying to do it all at once, I tend to find that trying to pull the lining over the body of the bag as the first step and then pop the whole thing right side out generally works well. But this is so soft that it actually worked really smoothly, and finally I left a large enough hole to make this a whole lot easier. And I'm always amazed how that crumpled mess can then suddenly just pop out and become a bag. Absolutely amazing to me. I reach my hand inside the lining, the opening in the lining, and then just use my fingers to push those boxed corners out so that they are nice and sharp, because that's going to be the outside of your bag. You're going to be able to see that, so you want those corners to be nice and sharp. I'll ultimately take this over to the iron and probably give everything just a little bit of a press. I might even press some seams into the bottom, press some creases into the bottom just so that that bottom of the bag is nice and firm. But that's essentially the end of the bag. I'll press around that top opening to get that as a nice sharp turn. And then the last step will be to sew up the inside of the bag. I'll just take a quick iron and make sure that that opening is pressed nice and flat, and then just take it over to the sewing machine and sew right across that open edge. Tuck it all back into the bag, and it's perfect. Pockets are facing the right way up. Everything looks really great. No hardware, no problem. Thanks very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoy this little project. And maybe this has spurned an interest in bag making for you. Or maybe not. Maybe it's confirmed that you just prefer the quilting part. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much for watching. And don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.